The Story of Sophie. Chapter 1, Sunlight Through Glass. Sophie Leblanc spent her morning as she had countless others, standing by the tall window of the city library in downtown Montreal, watching the winter sun filter through the foggy panes. A light frost etched patterns on them, resembling the cracked stained glass of an old cathedral. Outside, the snow creaked underfoot as people walked by, heads down, wrapped in scarves, avoiding each other's gaze. Sophie cherished this time, the hours before opening, when the library still slept, and one could feel like the only person in the city. She had long grown accustomed to the routine, opening the hall, sorting returned books, handling the small tasks that went unnoticed but without which everything would fall apart. For nearly 10 years she had worked as a librarian, and in that time she had learned everything about how other people's lives unfolded in the silence of the bookshelves. Each visitor left a trace, a dog-eared page, a forgotten bus ticket, a scrap of a letter slipped under a chair. Sophie collected these fragments like an archaeologist gathers shards, with reverence without judgment. Her life was measured and a bit weary. After her parents' death, she was left alone, with a small apartment on the third floor of an old building and a cat named Linda. She spent her vacations at her aunt's in Trois-Rivières, where time flowed even more slowly than in Montreal. Travel was for others, those whose photos she scrolled through on social media, who spoke at the book return desk about the beaches of Greece, the streets of Florence, and the bustling markets of Istanbul. Sophie listened and nodded, smiling politely, never admitting that she had never been farther than Ottawa. But that January, everything changed. Her colleague Laurent insisted she apply for a contest within the library system, a random drawing for a ticket to the International Book Fair in Paris. She didn't believe she would win, but exactly a week later, she received a letter. Sophie Leblanc, you are invited to a seminar as part of the fair, including airfare and accommodation. A coordinator contacted her, offering to choose a departure date. The letter had been lying on her desk for 2 days and she still couldn't bring herself to touch it. Inside her, joy and anxiety wrestled, as if someone had suddenly awakened a sleeping life. She didn't know how to be the center of attention, didn't know how to accept gifts. Her joy was always tied to what belonged to others, other people's successes, other people's holidays, even other people's books. She lived in other people's stories as if she hadn't earned her own. And yet, the thought that she would find herself in Paris, the city she had dreamed of visiting since childhood, warmed her in the morning silence like a cup of hot tea on a frosty day. By noon, the library came to life. Visitors entered, brushing off snow, asking for new novels, returning old ones. Sophie worked with her usual concentration, not thinking about Paris. She postponed the dream, like one postpones a favorite dessert, for later, for someday. In the evening, when the building was empty, she took out the letter again and reread it. This time something had changed. The words no longer seemed foreign. She began to imagine packing her suitcase, opening the window of her hotel room, and breathing in the Parisian air. And also, looking at the Eiffel Tower and thinking that all this was real. That night, Sophie fell asleep with the printed ticket under her pillow. She knew that ahead lay a flight, a foreign city, a new experience. She didn't know that on the plane, a meeting awaited her that would change everything. But for now, in her small apartment, where the kitchen smelled of apple pie, she simply allowed herself to feel, for the first time, that she too could be a heroine, even if just for a little while, even if only once, but in her own story. Chapter 2, Alone Among People. Pierre Elliott. Trudeau Airport greeted Sophie with the hum of voices, the blur of people, and the aroma of coffee wafting from countless kiosks. She had arrived long before boarding, not because she feared being late, but because everything still felt like a dream, and she wanted to absorb every detail. Her new suitcase rolled behind her across the marble floor, while inside a swirl of excitement, wonder, and quiet fear stirred. She chose a seat by the large window in the waiting area, where she could watch the planes. Families, young couples, business people with laptops, tired parents with children in backpack leashes passed her by. Everyone hurried, talked, scrolled through their phones. In this stream of humanity, Sophie felt like an observer, just like in the library, only without the shelves and the familiar silence. When her gate was called, she rose and slowly made her way toward it. The boarding line formed almost immediately, and Sophie took her place, trying not to look around. But then she noticed a man sitting alone in the corner by the window. He was alone. Around him, space remained empty, a rarity in such a crowded terminal. People didn't just avoid sitting next to him, they seemed to actively steer clear. He was of average height, dressed modestly but neatly. At first glance, just another passenger. But when he turned his head, the reason for the distance became clear. The right side of his face was covered in thick scars, the aftermath of severe burns. His skin was taut, distorting his expression. One eye appeared unnaturally dim, and the corner of his mouth was drawn inward, as if melted. His gloved hands rested on his knees, and through the fingerless fabric, damaged joints and scars were visible. He didn't look at anyone, as if long used to not expecting a glance in return. He sat still, gazing out the window where the typical airport bustle unfolded. Several people who approached the empty seat beside him quickly changed their minds and stepped away. Some did so openly with visible discomfort, others with a guilty glance. But the result was the same. A ring of emptiness surrounded him. He was among people, but completely cut off from them. Sophie felt a familiar heaviness in her chest. That look, tired, distant, restrained, she had seen before. Her father, after his stroke, often sat like that in buses and parks. It was then she first realized that a person can become invisible, even in a crowd. This man in the corner was invisible too, not because no one noticed him, but because they refused to see. He was fumbling with his backpack, clumsily, his hands trembling. A small first aid kit slipped from a side pocket, rolled across the floor, and stopped at the feet of a woman who stepped aside without picking it up. Sophie watched as the man slowly bent down to retrieve the fallen item. His movements were cautious, as if any sudden motion might cause pain. It was hard to tell what hurt more, his physical condition or the internal exile society had placed him in. Sophie gripped her bag's strap, her business class seat for the first time in her life. Inside her suitcase, her new dress, neatly organized documents, a Paris guidebook, notes of what she wanted to see at the Musée d'Orsay. And yet, watching this man, she felt a thin, invisible thread connecting them. As a librarian, she was used to noticing the unnoticed. A glance, an expression, a shift in posture. This man wasn't asking for sympathy, but he wasn't hiding his pain either. He simply lived with it, every day, every hour. Chapter 3. Flying in Her Own Way. Sophie stood at the airplane stairway, holding her boarding pass marked 2A Brr. Business class, her first time. The people in line behind her looked confident, comfortable, as if they flew like this every week. She felt like a guest at someone else's celebration, even though this ticket was a hard-earned reward for years of quiet effort, for unnoticed work, for the random chance that had suddenly fallen into her hands. But as she walked through the cabin, past the man with the scars to whom she had just offered her seat, all her internal script unraveled. At first he had refused. Then he accepted, not as a favor, but as an equal. In that moment, a strange, almost wordless agreement was born between them. Neither owed the other anything, but both understood that something important had happened. Sophie now sat in a firm seat by the window at the very back of economy. To her right, a teenager with headphones. To her left, an elderly woman who had already dropped her bag on Sophie's feet before takeoff. The food was cold, the blanket was thin, the restroom always occupied, and yet Sophie felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. During one of the layovers, stepping out of the restroom, she passed the first-class cabin. The man, now in seat 2A, saw her and nodded slightly. His eyes were calm, grateful. She nodded back, briefly, but with understanding. He didn't smile, but his gaze spoke volumes. At some point during the flight, a flight attendant handed Sophie a napkin. On it, handwritten words, "Thank you for reminding me who I am. TR." Sophie tucked the napkin into her notebook. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't show anyone. It was a gift, modest but real. Paris was beautiful. The bridges, the smell of coffee, the street noise, the book fair, the little bookstores. even the corner bakeries. They all felt vibrant, alive. But most often, Sophie thought not of the Louvre or the Seine, but of that man. His face, his eyes, the silence between them. Chapter 4, Just a Regular Morning. Sophie woke up 15 minutes before her alarm. That happened often, her internal clock always slightly ahead of schedule. Outside the window it was the same February morning, gray and heavy. The light hadn't yet broken through the clouds and the world beyond the glass looked as if it were cut from cardboard. Everything was just as always. And in that always, Sophie found her usual anchor. The kettle boiling, the smell of toasted bread, the soft steps of Linda the cat crossing the hallway. She turned on the radio. The announcer's voice spoke of traffic jams and a coming cold front. Everything was going according to plan. Her coffee sat in her favorite chipped mug. Her coat, the familiar gray one she always wore on weekdays. And yet, inside there was a strange uncertainty. She couldn't explain why she felt a faint tension, as if something in the air had shifted, but she hadn't noticed it yet. The library was closed today. Sophie wasn't planning to go anywhere. She had intended to spend the day at home, sorting through a pile of letters, tending to her windowsill plants, rereading an old novel she had set aside since autumn. The quiet of the apartment reminded her just how much she had grown attached to solitude, not as a burdensome emptiness, but as a refuge where she could be herself without explanation. She was about to brew a second pot of tea when a strange sound broke the morning routine. At first, she thought it was the boiler, or maybe a neighbor slamming a door too hard. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a giant. The windows began to tremble. A vase on the shelf wobbled, and the cat jumped off the windowsill and darted under the couch. Sophie went to the window. The first thing she saw was light. Not bright, but dense, like a spotlight in a theater. It cut through the morning haze, illuminating the familiar vacant lot behind her building. Where people usually walk their dogs, a helicopter was slowly descending. White fuselage, green stripes, the words Forces Armées Canadiennes on the side. It wasn't a rescue helicopter, or a news one. It was military. She stood still, clutching the windowsill. Outside, uniformed figures moved quickly. Black vehicles with tinted windows had already pulled up to the building. One man spoke into a radio. Another held a folder in his hands. Sophie backed away from the window, feeling her fingers tremble. Everything inside her resisted what was happening, not out of fear, but confusion. Why? Why her? She quickly looked around the apartment. The unmade blanket, the half-finished tea, a stack of magazines on the table. Everything looked far too ordinary for someone to show up here with briefcases and radios. She wasn't even dressed, still in an old home sweater. The thought that this might be a mistake flashed through her mind, but vanished the moment a clear, confident knock echoed at the door. 3 short raps, not the timid bell of a neighbor or the rushed visit of a courier. Sophie approached the door and paused for a moment. Then she opened it. A tall man stood on the threshold wearing a black jacket marked with the security service insignia. He had cold, focused eyes and a very polite tone. He addressed her by name, introduced himself, and handed her a short message. Ms. Leblanc, you are requested to prepare. In 20 minutes, you'll be escorted to the helicopter. Commander Reeves would like to meet with you personally. Everything will be explained upon arrival. She couldn't find the words. She simply nodded. When the door closed, she stood for several seconds in the hallway, leaning against the wall. Then she moved quickly. Chose simple clothes, jeans, a sweater, a warm parka. Grabbed her backpack, unsure what to pack, and settled on documents, a wallet, a notebook, and a hairbrush. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the courtyard. The wind from the rotor blades whipped her face. Sophie shielded her eyes. One of the escorts took her backpack. Another offered a hand, helping her up the steps. The cabin was cramped but clean. The windows were tinted, the inside detached from the outside world. As the helicopter lifted off, Sophie looked down. Her house looked like a toy. Her neighbors' roofs, just colorless patches. And on the edge of the lot stood people, some filming with their phones, some waving, some simply watching, not understanding what was happening. Sophie didn't understand either. But deep inside, everything suddenly went quiet, like in those moments when you realize you're meant to be part of something important. Even if you didn't ask for it, even if you weren't ready, but inside something tells you, you did the right thing. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the world is finally speaking back. Chapter 5, A Northern Gift. Sophie didn't know what to expect. No one asked her questions. They simply, gently but firmly, informed her that Commander Reeves wanted to show her something special. Since the moment the helicopter had taken off from Montreal, everything felt like a dream where reality obeyed someone else's logic. She sat in her seat with headphones on, listening as the pilot exchanged brief messages with dispatch. Outside the window stretched endless snowy plains, frozen rivers, hills, and sparse forest lines. This was a different world, northern, nearly silent, detached from all haste. After 3 hours, the helicopter began to descend. Below appeared a snow-packed airstrip. A few buildings, painted in gray and white, almost disappeared into the landscape. The base lay at the foot of a hill, where even the wind felt different. It didn't whistle but sang, a deep hum that crept beneath your clothing. As she stepped out of the helicopter, she was met by a young man in an army jacket, his patch reading Lieutenant Fraser. His greeting was crisp, military short, but his eyes were warm. They walked along a wooden pathway to the administrative building. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, diesel, and something metallic. There was a true silence here. Not like in a library, but a physical one that absorbed sound. Sophie was issued a winter uniform, an insulated parka, gloves, and a hat. The clothes were not new but well cared for, with stitching and the initials of previous owners. While she changed, Fraser waited by the door, then led her on a tour. The base turned out to be larger than it looked from above. Researchers, meteorologists, doctors, and several dozen military personnel worked here. Some were collecting climate data, others coordinated logistics for northern missions. They passed a dining hall that smelled of stewed meat and roasted vegetables. Inside, people sat at long tables, some in uniform, some in wool sweaters, some with laptops, some with maps. A few waved to her, some just nodded, not knowing who she was, but somehow sensing that her presence wasn't random. Later, she was taken to a small observation tower. Inside was a wood-burning heater, 2 armchairs, and a table with a thermos. A wide window looked out over a white valley, where far in the distance the ice glistened. Sophie sat down, wrapping herself in a blanket. That's when she noticed that Commander Reeves was already sitting in the other chair. He wore a dark blue sweater and looked much calmer than he had on the airplane. "Why did you bring me here?" she finally asked softly, breaking the silence. "Because you looked at me like a person, not with fear, not with pity, just as a human being." "I was afraid you'd think I was pitying you," Sophie admitted. "But I just couldn't walk past. That's all." And I didn't know how to respond. After that flight, it was the first time I felt like an officer again, like a father, not a burn. You don't know what it means to not be feared, to simply be asked, "Are you comfortable?" He spoke without drama, his voice rough but steady. Sophie felt there was more behind his words than gratitude. This was a confessional conversation, where no one tried to persuade the other, just two people allowing themselves to be real. "You know, I don't feel worthy of all this," she said quietly. "The flight, the base, the attention. I just gave up my seat. Sometimes one gesture means more than 100 medals. And you made that gesture," he said. That evening, they dined together in the officers' mess hall. Sophie listened to conversations at the nearby tables, the clink of spoons, brief commands, warm laughter. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet somehow deeply human. Later, when she returned to her room, an envelope was waiting on her bed. Inside was a silver pin with the base's emblem and a handwritten note. "You made us visible, and we want you to remain in our memory." Signed, TR. That night, Sophie returned to the observation tower. In the sky, green and violet ribbons flowed. The northern lights moved like the breath of the world. She stood in the silence and thought. Her small gesture had become something that awakened a whole chain of events. Not a miracle, not a fairy tale, just a motion of the heart, which meant it was real. Chapter 6, Not for Thanks. Sophie returned to Montreal aboard the same military aircraft, but everything now felt different. The takeoff no longer felt like a daunting leap into the unknown, and the engine's rumble had become almost comforting. She sat by the window, gazing at the clouds, while somewhere in another section, officers and crew members carried on quiet conversations. She didn't want to think about returning. After several days in the north, surrounded by silence and sky, the city seemed too loud, too flat. When her car stopped in front of her building, dry, powdery snow had just begun to fall. She stood on the porch for a while, not going inside. She walked over to the mailbox. Amid the usual mail was a stiff envelope with the insignia of the Canadian Armed Forces. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Slightly slanted, precise, with just a hint of hesitation in the strokes. Inside was a ticket, first class, a flight to Sydney, the date, 2 weeks from now. No explanation, no formalities, just a small card tucked inside, on which was written, "If you fly with me, I'll feel calmer. Not as a commander, as a person. James." Sophie slowly sat down on the edge of her couch. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the ticket, holding it between her fingers, as if it might melt. Inside her, the old struggle began again. She didn't like being the center of anything. She wasn't used to accepting gifts. She was a librarian from Montreal. No heroic deeds, no shining medals. All she had done was offer someone her seat. Was that really enough to deserve all of this? There was no clear answer, and that was why the doubt remained. What if this was a mistake? What if her gesture was just a coincidence, and she had become a convenient symbol that looked good in someone's report? She picked up her phone several times to call James, but she didn't know what to say, and each time she put the phone down again. The next morning, she arrived at the library earlier than usual. Laurent, her colleague with kind eyes and a loud scarf, noticed her first. He placed a cup of coffee beside her and sat across from her. "You look pale, like a student before an exam," he said. "What's going on?" Sophie was silent for a long time. Then she told him. Everything, about the plane, the base, the northern lights, the ticket, and the doubt. Laurent listened without interrupting. Then he simply said, "You still think what you did was just a coincidence?" "Maybe it was, but it's these kinds of coincidences that make us human, and maybe he's inviting you not as a reward, but because when he's with you, he gets to be himself." She sat alone in the reading room for a long time, listening to the drip of water from wet boots onto the carpet, the rustling of pages, the soft click of a cabinet lock. Inside, things grew quieter, a little calmer. Late that evening, she was packing her things, folding them carefully, simple items, nothing extra. When she opened the jewelry drawer, she chose a small pendant she'd worn since school, shaped like a feather. It was warm to the touch, like a memory that had never lost its weight. The next morning, Sophie stood at the boarding gate. The plane was ready, people bustled, calling children, checking tickets, and he stood calmly, dressed in civilian clothes, a backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing that same steady look she remembered. When he saw her, he didn't rush. He just nodded. There was no obligation in his gaze, no expectation. Just quiet relief, like someone who knows. The person who didn't look away at the most ordinary and most important moment is still here. They boarded together, and when Sophie settled into the seat he had once occupied, she felt, at last, that she was exactly where she belonged. Not in first class, not in the cabin, in life. This story began with a small gesture and turned into a journey without fanfare. But there was light, and snow, and sky, and one glance that brought back the feeling that a person is not what others say about them, but how they look at others. Not for thanks, but because there was no other way.